Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Consumer-Driven Open Banking, Ontario Credit Unions and Caisse Populaires. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And now I'd like to introduce David Maxwell, Head, Regulation and Strategic Initiatives. David, welcome.
Thanks, Tracy. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. I think this is obviously a hot topic, both for regulators as well as the sector. And this is an opportunity to sort of share some of the things that we've learned, both as part of the consultation and from our interactions with you, and encourage you to continue to share information with us to the extent possible, so that we can make this process as simple as possible for everyone. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see as part of our agenda today, I'll restate the purpose and sort of talk about what it is that we're hoping to achieve. Ultimately, I think we'd like to focus mostly on the results of the survey that all of you participated in the earlier part of this year, talk about the results to a certain extent, but more so about how we're trying to use that information as we look to get our arms around what the regime will ultimately look like going forward. I think we've shared the deck in advance. Hopefully that has gone over well, because there are quite a few sort of numbers and charts and other things coming out of that survey. And so we'll be focusing less on the particular numbers and more so on, again, what the next steps are and how we're planning to use this data as we advocate on your behalf vis-a-vis the federal government, as well as making sure that we're able to get the sector ready. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this. I will say in advance that we may not always have satisfying answers to your questions. There's a lot that's still up in the air in terms of ultimately what the regime will look like and how FSRA fits into it. But please do ask the questions anyway. We will answer them to the best of our ability, but also the questions themselves will factor into our future work, understanding the perspectives of the sector and making sure that they're reflected as the regime starts to crystallize. I want to say that I'll be joined by a couple of my colleagues in the course of this presentation. Brad Hodgins and Catherine Tam have been on the front lines of this exercise and will be helping me with the presentation itself. And for the question portion, Kirk Quinn will be joining us to provide the market conduct perspective on any of the questions that you might have for us. However, before we get started, on the next slide, it's important that we acknowledge that the land we are on is traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So again, just to talk a little bit more about the purpose here, obviously we want to share back with you the results of our thematic review and questionnaire from earlier this year. I think foster an understanding of how we're approaching the ongoing discussions with partners at various levels as we look to shape the regime that will eventually be in place. We're also hoping to encourage more of a dialogue with credit unions bilaterally. I think the relationship with your relationship manager at FSRA is a great way to spark this conversation to help us understand the work that you're undertaking to the extent that you are in fact preparing to opt in for open banking. The more we know, the more we're able to set up the sector for success and ensure that there's a level playing field vis-a-vis federally regulated credit institutions and no additional hoops that credit unions have to jump through. And as I said, there will be an opportunity to ask questions directly to FSRA staff with the previously mentioned caveat that We may not always have answers. However, we will be transparent about that and factor your views into our ongoing work. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Catherine Tam, who's going to take us through the first part of this presentation. Catherine?
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. So I would like to start off by recapping and contrasting today's banking model with the one that we are looking forward in the future. On the left-hand side, we have a closed banking system where banks and credit unions control access to the consumer data. For example, if the consumer would like to purchase additional services from the fintech, they would need to give up their banking credentials like login and passwords to the fintech, allowing the fintech to illegally scrape information off the credit union or the bank. So this would pose all parties to significant security, privacy, and liability risks. On the right-hand side, which is the future state, this is the consumer-driven banking model, where the consumer would have control over their own data. They decide who they want to share it with their explicit consent. So imagine a whole ecosystem built around with API pipes connecting all the participants together, but only qualified participants are allowed to enter the system after they have demonstrated they have passed minimum standards in terms of security and technical standards. This model is expected to increase competition, broaden the suite of products and services among the whole system, as well as enhancing the overall financial inclusion outcome. In terms of addressing security, privacy, and liability risk, say for security and privacy, because minimum standards are met, data is only moved through secure pipes, addressing both security and privacy. On the liability side, because of traceability of information flow, this will determine the party at fault and therefore will hold the party liable if any harm is being caused. Next. Now here is the federal timeline as determined by the federal level. There are lots of dates here, but the key takeaway is that everything started in 2018 with very slow progress in the first few years, but with lots of momentum over the last year, starting with the release of the fourth economic statement in November 2023, followed by the budget announcement by the Fed in the springtime. The consumer-driven banking framework has also been put into legislation officially after the Budget Implementation Act No. 1 has received royal consent in June 2024. As of today, the Budget Implementation Act No. 2 consultation has just been concluded, but we are expecting more legislative work in the fall with rules and regulation development in 2025. The latest that we have heard from the federal government is that the go-live date is now expected to be early to mid 2026. Next slide. So in alignment with the federal timeline, here are some of the key initiatives this year that has taken place at FSRA and also in the Ontario Ministry of Finance. And we know that our ministry is also in attendance today. In February, you would recall that FSRA has released a survey, which was due in April, on April 30th. Thank you to all who has participated in this survey. It's very helpful, allowing FSRA to have a look at the results since then. In May, we have conducted a similar webinar on operational risk and resilience guidance, as well as the FSRA IT risk management guidance, allowing opportunities for us to first discuss about the topic. During the spring and summertime this year, the MOF and FSRA has participated in federal finance hosted BIA2 consultation meetings. And we understand that some CUs as well as CCUA is also participating in a parallel series with the Department of Finance. So we're pretty much on the same page there. In July, the MOF has hosted a roundtable with CCUN and the sector, as well as FSRA in attendance, allowing more opportunity to discuss the topic. Today, here we are very excited to share our results on the survey with you and continue our discussion. Looking into the rest of the year, we are expecting more legislative work at the federal level government, where we will also be a participant of. Next slide. Our intention today, like David mentioned, is not to go over the details of the framework, like what's in BIA 1 and BIA 2. They can be found in the summary of the, they can be found as a summary in the appendices of this deck. And for more information, there's also good materials from the budget announcement itself. But we do want to overemphasize again the overarching principles of the framework itself, which is the balance between the supporting innovation and competition and safeguarding privacy and security of consumer data. This is to provide sufficient controls as well as reasonable guardrails for participants to enter the system and stay in the system without hampering innovation and competition at the same time. The federal government has highlighted different participants of the system. And on this table, you will see credit union being referenced in bold here for our reference. They are not required to participate, so participation is not mandatory for provincially regulated credit unions, and they are also exempted from accreditation. However, they will be subject to certification for meeting minimum technical standards and security standards, and this will be done through the provincial regulator. And for Ontario, this will be FSRA. The Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, FCAC, the federal level market conduct regulator, has been mandated to provide oversight, administration, and enforcement of the future consumer-driven banking framework, to be led by its Senior Deputy Commissioner, which is a newly created position. We are looking forward to the announcement of the filling of this position. And they will be mandated to supervise and enforce the framework on new participants such as fintechs. With that, I'm just gonna pass it over to Brad, and Brad will walk us through some of FSRA's early thinking on approaches.
Thank you, Catherine. As Catherine outlined, the legislation and regulation at the federal level has not yet been finalized. Credit unions that are interested in participating in consumer-driven banking are encouraged to take the time now to ensure that they have the appropriate policies, procedures, and supporting functions within their credit unions to meet the outcomes outlined in FSRA rules and guidance. While credit unions are expected to meet the outcomes outlined in all rules and guidance, the following provide the majority of the outcomes relevant to the implementation of consumer-driven banking. And these are the Sound Business and Financial Practices Rule for credit unions, the Credit Union Market Conduct Framework, the IT Risk Management Guidance, and the Operational Risk and Resilience Guidance. The development of the Operational Risk and Resilience Guidance, as well as the IT Risk Management Guidance, were completed with a forward-looking view to facilitate innovation, which includes consumer-driven banking. Next slide, please. On February 20th of 2024, FSRA distributed a questionnaire to all credit unions to help facilitate a thematic review of the consumer-driven banking, or open banking as was previously referred to. The questionnaire aligned FSRA's statutory objects, as shown here, and evidenced FSRA's desire to proactively understand the sector's interest and level of understanding of consumer-driven banking in order to facilitate and support the implementation for credit unions in Ontario. The questionnaire contained 11 questions. It observed proportionality and incorporated flexibility. For example, for those credit unions that intend to opt out, could skip most of the questions in the questionnaire. FSRA thanks all credit unions for completing the questionnaire that allowed for a fulsome review to be completed. The results of the thematic review enhanced FSRA's readiness in anticipating legislative framework at the federal level, as well as understanding credit unions' approach in preparing for consumer-driven banking implementation. Next slide, please. Of the 57 Ontario credit unions, 14, or roughly 26% of the sector, stated that their intention was to opt in to participate in consumer-driven banking, while 27% were undecided, 27 credit unions, or roughly half of those credit unions, were undecided, and the remaining 16, or 28% of the sector, intended to opt out. And this proportion was predominantly the smaller credit unions that were intending to opt out. Now, some of the reasons intending to opt in included the need to maintain competitiveness, open up opportunities and innovation, and align with credit unions' values to help members manage their finances. Reasons provided for why they chose undecided at this point, or were undecided at this point in time, was that they were awaiting additional information and detailed requirements, the framework and the legislation for consumer-driven banking, to make an informed decision as to how best to proceed. And finally, for those who are choosing to opt out or had selected that option at this point, there were concerns around the cost of implementation for their credit unions. Now, we've also learned that some large credit unions have illustrated their strong interest in consumer-driven banking by participating in some of the federal government-hosted working groups, as well as looking at partnerships with vendors and fintechs to help facilitate the implementation of consumer-driven banking for their institution. Next slide, please. So of the 41 credit unions, it stated that they either intend to opt in or are at this point undecided. There were 22 credit unions that have full-time employees engaged in some aspect of consumer-driven banking activities. As shown on the chart on the left, credit unions from all asset groups have FTEs engaged in consumer-driven banking. That being said, most of these employees are not fully dedicated to consumer-driven banking, even for those at large credit unions, and are doing so on a project basis as part of their overall responsibilities. 37 of the 41 credit unions have stated that they intend to opt in or undecided have had board level discussions about consumer-driven banking. Some as part of a formal agenda and some as just discussions, not as part of a formal discussion or just a formal agenda item. Next slide, please. 31 of the 41 credit unions that are intending to opt in or are undecided reported a high level of readiness, either generally ready or significantly ready, in adhering to the best practices outlined in FSRA's operational risk and resilience guidance and the IT risk management guidance. Please note that this is a self-assessment and not a determination by FSRA at this point in time, as this will be assessed as part of the RBSF process. Of the 31 credit unions, 23 identified themselves as generally ready, positioning themselves within the developing stage of the overall resilience and IT risk management maturity model. The 14 credit unions that have chosen to opt in at this point indicated that they are either significantly ready or generally ready to meet the requirements of FSRA guidance, which is very good news. Larger credit unions are primarily in alignment. However, smaller and mid-sized credit unions have also reported their readiness, showing that operational resilience and IT risk management are focus areas for smaller credit unions as well. I would now like to hand the presentation over to David to continue with the results of the thematic review.
Sorry, still learning to work the mute button. Brad has sort of elaborated on the first part of the survey, which is really about a point in time assessment of the work that credit unions have already put into this initiative, assuming that there was an intention to opt in. And we're very much aware that intentions may have changed in the intervening period. And so I want to stress again the importance of transparency vis-a-vis FSRA with respect to both your intentions and your approach, so that we're in a position to, collaboratively approach this initiative in a way that's going to be as seamless as possible for our regulated credit unions. The next part of the survey focused a bit more on, I want to say, more technical details. I'm not going to go through them in a huge amount of detail because I think you all had the deck. Feel free to ask any questions about these, but more so some overarching comments. In terms of the IT risk management framework used by CUs, we're seeing a range of standards, of industry standards that are being referred to. And this is something that's important for us as we look to sort of understand what the federal requirements are ultimately going to be. As you can see, CIS, NIST, ISO are all quite popular, and we can talk a little bit later as to what the implications of that are. Ultimately, our understanding is that at the outset, for the read-only phase of consumer-driven banking implementation, there will be no dictated standard in this regard. And so I think, you know, while there may be rumors swirling around about a preferred industry standard in this regard, I would suggest to you that federal finance is currently in the process of assessing and mapping the associated requirements to identify any gaps, and that will ultimately inform their views on the value of a single standard in this regard. Moving on to the next. Cybersecurity maturity assessments are obviously something that we would look to as evidence that credit unions are ready for open banking, and it's a great way for you to demonstrate alignment with elements of the IT risk guidance and the op risk and resilience guidance. Ultimately, we do see a fair amount of activity in this space, which is gratifying. PRA Canada is the sort of preferred provider of these audits. I do want to qualify that that's largely a result of their association with CUSA, as well as certain core banking systems. But regardless of the provider, I want to stress that for those who are choosing to opt in, that this is good practice, and we're happy to see that it's been widely adopted. On to the next. So this is an area where we really do want to understand more. Partnerships with solution providers, and we'll talk on the next slide about partnerships with fintechs. We were able to get some insights through the survey, but this is ultimately where we are learning things through press releases, which, useful as they are, we would like to be a little bit more engaged in this conversation with credit unions, not because we'll have necessarily a particular view on your partnerships, but again, it helps us understand the ecosystem. It helps us understand where we should be focusing our efforts. And it helps us as we advocate for, again, a relatively seamless experience, or as seamless as possible when it comes to the implementation of open banking. So to the extent that you provided responses in the survey, thank you. To the extent that you did not, or that your views are evolving, please do reach out to your relationship manager to start a conversation in this regard. Again, we're not endorsing any particular providers or fintechs at this point, but it is very helpful for us to understand what the ecosystem is likely to look like and how it's evolving. On to the next. And as I said, again, these partnerships with fintechs, I think fostering an understanding on the part of FSRA about not just partnerships, but how they're evolving, any roadblocks that you're experiencing, and any questions about the implications for your own systems, your own controls, your own processes, your own people. This is a conversation that we're very much looking to have bilaterally with each of our credit unions that is exploring this space. And this brings us to API and technical standards. I think some work is clearly already taking place in the sector, which is great. We're closely monitoring developments with respect to FTX, which, while there's no certainty, is looking like a candidate to be the single technical standard for data exchange in this regard. Again, we have a point in time set of data here that we are very much looking forward to stay up to date on. So at the risk of starting to sound a little desperate as I say this at every slide, please do reach out. we do want to understand how you're progressing on this front. Next slide, please. So in terms of next steps, I think what I want to emphasize is that at this point we are not planning to issue any additional guidance on this subject. That's always subject to change to the extent that the regime warrants it, or to the extent that we're seeing so many questions from credit unions that there's evidence that more guidance is warranted. Will absolutely change the plan, but at this point, we feel like demonstrating alignments with the SBFP rule, with our conduct framework, with the IT risk management guidance and the operational risk and resilience guidance will be sufficient in order to give us confidence that you're able to manage the associated risks, which is ultimately core to the certification process. And I think already seeing a couple of questions coming in regarding the certification process, which is not surprising. We'll address those, I think, specifically once we get to the question period. But just so you know, this is something that we're very conscious of. We know that it's of great importance to the sector. We are going to continue to be transparent with the sector as we learn more. There are a lot of moving pieces here. Again, we are pushing for deference to provincial regulators when it comes to all elements of this framework. Again, with the goal being a level playing field for both federally and provincially regulated financial institutions. And we will continue to work both with the CCUA and with you individually to ensure that your views are heard as part of this process, and that this ultimately evolves in a way that makes sense for Ontario credit unions. So a couple of questions here that I won't reiterate, but again, these are where we are interested in getting your feedback, either through forums like this or through your relationship manager. And I think, again, the theme here being the more information that we have, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions on your behalf as this regime starts to crystallize. Brad, Catherine, anything else in terms of next steps before we move on to questions?
Just to say that we are actively involved in the discussions as legislation is getting built. We have been invited to participate and help to make sure that the legislation does work, not only for the federally regulated entities, but for provincially regulated entities as well.
Great. Okay, so let's move on to the questions then, and I'm going to ask Kirk to join us on screen so that he can provide us with his expertise as well. Welcome to the party, Kirk. And actually, as it turns out, first question, I think, has a market conduct bent. So it says, understanding that the views on the relationship between credit unions and the regulator are still evolving. At this point, what can credit unions expect with respect to their relationship with FSRA as we proceed into consumer-driven banking? Oh, Kirk, I think you're muted.
Kirk, can you hear us? I think we can hear you now. Oh, no, I think, Kirk, maybe you've muted your headset. You're unmuted on the GoToWebinar control panel.
No.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. So my apologies to all. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for the question. Thanks, David. For the most part, and for most credit unions, it will be business as usual from a conduct perspective. I think the question as it's posed in terms of the evolutionary nature of this aspect with consumer-driven banking is well placed, and taken. The approach from FSRA in terms of conduct supervision is going to be part of the ongoing discussions with our partners as we determine how consumer-driven banking is going to be supervised from a conduct approach. But for those that do not opt in, there will be no material change in terms of conduct supervision, the approach, or the expectations. For those that do opt into open banking or consumer-driven banking, the goal is obviously the same goal that you have as an industry, that an appropriate level of supervision and control is applied to this added level of risk that's presented by open banking and all the aspects that go along with it. Our goal is obviously the same as your goal as credit unions, individual credit unions, and as a sector, and that's to minimize the risk of poor or unfair outcomes for members as they also opt into and grow with this new evolution in terms of products and services.
Thanks, Kirk. And I would guess say the same from a Prudential perspective. You know, we're very much looking forward to seeing how this shakes out. But our hope is that you know, it will very much feel like it does now. And while there may be an additional focus on certain elements that come out of a federal framework, I don't imagine that there should be too many changes. Yeah, to the extent that that changes, we will let you know. So there are quite a few questions here specifically about the certification process. And will there be a separate process? Can we provide more insight into what a certification process might look like? I think I will provide some maybe high-level thoughts at the outset, and then Catherine, Brad can turn it over to you. Again, we don't have full clarity on this situation yet, but what we're envisioning is that the certification work is already underway, and we have, I guess, while the op risk and resilience and IT risk guidance are both relatively new, it's not as if we weren't already assessing against the elements that are contained in there. And so, you know, I understand that for some of you, your RBSF assessment was completed this year or will be completed very shortly this year. Others haven't had an RBSF assessment since 2022. And so our specific information in that regard may be a little stale. But just know that we will be working very hard to make sure that our understanding of your approach is up to date. And ultimately, certification, rather than being a separate process, is envisioned for now as being a part of our understanding of your risks, of our broader RBSF process, through assessments, through monitoring, through thematic reviews, understanding your ability to manage the associated risks and your ability to evidence that those risks are effectively managed. And so that is the sort of the high level vision at this point. Catherine, Brad, anything to add?
I think you covered it well, David, but I just want to add that we are constantly doing like mapping exercises between what's in our guidance as well as anticipating what will be some of the legislation content, right? So to the extent that there would be new requirements, that will be reflected in a similar process of assessment here at FSRA, but no material changes in terms of structure or anything like that. But so we're constantly monitoring the development at the federal level discussion and see how does it affect our own assessments. But the channel would be the same in terms of dedicated components with some of our assessment. You would also be able to find information as currently available in our guidance itself, operational risk and resilience guidance, IT risk management guidance, as well as our sound business and financial practices rule, which you'll be very familiar with through our engagement with you on the RBSF assessment. So just want to add that little flavor.
Great. Just another question has come in that sort of has a little nuance to it, and basically asking if we have enough visibility into the federal process in order to ensure that we are working in parallel. I think I would say that at a high level, absolutely yes. I think we have a good sense of where things are trending, and are making sure that our processes continue to align with that, so that we don't end up with first of all, any surprises for the sector, but certainly any surprises for ourselves when the regime does actually drop. Catherine, you've been closer to that specific process. Did I tell any lies?
No, we haven't. We have been doing everything that we can in order to be staying close with the development at the federal level, including attending all the consultation meeting for BIA2 hosted by the federal government, as well as in roundtables and in future legislation review work. We have also been invited together with our ministry in attending. So I understand that in those meetings, I think CCUA as well as certain credit unions are also in attendance with similar discussions. I think the Fed has done a good job in engaging all the external stakeholders to ensure that everybody is on the same page. We also having regular dialogues with our peer regulators through our CUPSR meetings, so that we have a glimpse on what their intentions are at the different provinces as well. So I think through all those engagement and discussions, we are all trying to march towards the same goal, which is provide a more streamlined implementation for our sector here, and for us, it's the Ontario credit union sector.
Great, thanks, Catherine. A number of questions here about new guidance, about more detailed expectations. I think I covered that to a certain extent, but to emphasize that, I mean, we're ultimately evidence-based when it comes to issuing any new rules and guidance. I think the view at this point is that the outcomes that have been articulated in both the op risk and resilience guidance and the IT risk guidance continue to be relevant, and that we feel like the onus is rightly on credit unions to demonstrate how they're achieving those outcomes. But we are very happy to take a collaborative approach with this and work with you to understand what you have in place and the extent to which those outcomes are being achieved. So I would say that that is plan A. Bilateral interactions, again, transparency both ways, to understand how we can all get a level of comfort with the requirements and with the associated controls. To the extent that there's overwhelming evidence that the sector needs more formal guidance in that regard, then we will consider that and consult with the sector along the way. Question from our friends at the CCUA. Will FSRA be the only stakeholder involved within certification process for Ontario CUs? Also, is there a way to streamline and simplify this process based on RBSF assessments and existing adherence to guidance and rules? And I think the concern here being that certification does not become a significant resource draw on credit unions, to make sure that this can be implemented as quickly and as effectively as possible. All fair questions from our friends at CCUA. Again, the regime is still coming into shape. And as I said, our priority is to ensure deference to the provincial regulator wherever possible. And so I think, as I've already articulated, reliance on existing RBSF assessments, ensuring that those assessments are current and remain relevant, will be a huge focus for us going forward. And by us, I mean, unfortunately, mostly Catherine. Sorry, Catherine. But ultimately, you know, again, not to restate what I've already said a couple of times, but the goal here is a level playing field, and to ensure that those who are able to demonstrate that they can manage the associated risks are able to participate with as few barriers as possible. Question about the survey itself. This one for you, Catherine. If we indicated we are opting out, but still answered all 11 questions, were our responses included in the results or automatically grouped in the response not provided?
So the way that we did our analysis is that if it's if the answer is opt out, then most of the data points in the graphs would be turning up blank. So that would align with the 40, I think 41, that's total out of the 57 that has been categorized as opt-in and undecided. However, we do look at your results in another format where you may not show on the graphs, but we do look at the results and we'll also factor it into our part of our information feed into our RBSF assessment. Those results, again, is just a point in time, and we understand that things would keep evolving through the continuous work at the credit union, and we won't take these results as is. And when it comes to RBSF assessment, we will have continuous dialogue with the credit union as we understand more what's development at the credit union.
Great, thank you, Catherine. Question here that says, is FSRA expecting any new or increased costs related to certification or other elements of consumer-driven banking back onto the sector? Is FSRA trying to contain these costs within current expertise and structure? Maybe I'll start with this one as well and then turn it over to the team. These are all risks that FSRA expects you to manage regardless of whether or not you're opting into consumer-driven banking, which is why the guidance that was issued applies to all credit unions, not just those that are opting in. So while there will be an additional level of work leading up to the implementation of CDB for credit unions, primarily by FSRA, again, seeking to understand your approach, any sort of costs related to managing the associated risks, I would say should be independent of the CDB process in that they're good practice for everyone. Obviously, we scale our expectations based on size and complexity. We also scale them based on the types of activities that you're engaged in. And so again, smaller credit unions that have opted out, we may have a higher tolerance for residual risk in that regard. But I think it's a bit misleading to attribute any increased costs, at least as they relate to systems, controls, people, as being specifically related to consumer-driven banking in this regard. That being said, we're not anticipating at this time any direct costs from FSRA associated with this. And to the extent that that changes, we'll certainly be transparent with the sector. Question here, can we access the list of CUs that have indicated opting in as to collaborate and work collectively going forward? I think we've committed at this point to sharing this data on an aggregate basis. I would suggest that the CCUA is probably a logical place for you to identify who else has opted in. And I would suggest that that would be as easy as telling them that you've opted in and that they can share your info with anybody else who's communicated that they're opting in. But at this point, I think the nature of our information collection is such that in order to promote sharing that information with us, we commit to only sharing it collectively, or sorry, at an aggregate level in collective settings like this. Looking at remaining questions here. There's some thank yous for sharing the material. You're welcome. I think this is something that we do when it is, when it will help the discussion. So we've done it for the last 2 webinars where there was a lot of numbers involved. It may not be the case for our next one. So wherever possible, we share the material ahead of time. Regardless, we will always try and share it with you after the fact. Although I would stress that you're always welcome to share the materials within your credit union. But we think there's real value in actually being part of the discussion and hearing the context that we provide. So whenever possible, we would encourage you to invite your colleagues and your peers to these specific settings in addition to sharing the materials. I will give it another minute of moderately awkward silence to see if any other questions come in. In the meantime, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to engage with us on this topic. Again, would encourage you to reach out to your relationship manager and engage with us on where you are in this journey, what obstacles you're facing, and what your priorities are vis-a-vis both our approach and the broader regime, so that we can factor that into our thinking. Again, the more we know, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions on your behalf. And thank you also to those who have been directly involved in the consultation process with the Ministry of Finance, with Federal Finance, and through the CCUA, because again, the more we get a sense of your views, the better off we all are. Seeing no further questions, I will thank you again for your time and wish you all a great day.
Thank you.